Hi guys, welcome to the Liberty Bunker. Now before we begin, just wanted to say get well soon to our Prime Minister Boris Johnson. It really doesn't matter if you're left wing, right wing. Boris Johnson really is a one in a million person. He's charismatic, he's charming. Pretty much everybody that comes across him really likes him. He's obviously going through a very hard time now. Once you're in the ICU with COVID-19, it's really not good, and it is a big fight to push through it. So the best of strength to our Prime Minister. Hope he bounces back soon and gets back the reins of this country, leading with his unique brand of politics. Be very much looking forward to Boris Johnson bouncing back very soon. So this is a study from the Henry Jackson Society, which is a think tank. They've done this looking at the compensation that China could pay Western or just any nations across the globe. Let's take a close look at this. So this is coronavirus compensation, assessing China's potential culpability and avenues of legal response. Now, if we read from here, as a result of the breaches of international law, the report assesses that potential damages liable against China at the time of writing could run to £3.2 trillion from just G7 nations. The UK is said to have a claim worth a potential £351 billion in damages based on formally announced government spending. Using the same methodology, the US, meanwhile, could claim £933 billion, Canada £47 billion, and Australia £29 billion. Now, this is kind of a study based on like economic damages, what sort of level of spending the government are going to do to mitigate it. Now, this is the full report here. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to read the entire report in its complete state. But if you look at the legal avenues, they're looking at recouping this money. I don't really have a huge amount of hope. These legal challenges are so difficult. I mean, under American law, the US Constitution essentially bars the federal government from punishing overseas nations. So there could possibly have to be some constitutional amendments. But however, there are some of these international laws in place. So we have. We'll just skim through them. We won't read them. But international law, international health regulations. These are the various avenues that the various G7 nations could use to get money back from China or get compensation back from China. We have International Court of Justice and Permanent Court of Arbitration. There's the World Trade Organization, bilateral investment treaties, which they'll probably be in breach of, United Nations Convention on the Law of Sea, Commission of Inquiry and Advisory Opinions, domestic law and Chinese courts, English and Welsh courts, US federal courts. Is that the last one? Yeah, that's the last one. So there are different avenues that G7 nations, US, UK could look at doing through getting reparations, compensation back from China. Now, this is rapidly descending into something of a propaganda war. We've seen this with, Russia bringing aid to Italy, China bringing aid to Italy. China is currently on the offensive with a Facebook ad campaign. So China floods Facebook with undeclared coronavirus propaganda ads blaming Trump. So there's a lot of spin on this. We can see China really wants to squirm out of this. It wants to squirm out of its responsibility, obviously, because, if you have many trillions of pounds of, law action coming against you, you really want to try and squirm out of it as best you can. So that does seem to be working. I mean, it's really driven a wedge between EU nations. Italy really feels let down by the lack of help coming from the European Union, but they're getting help from Russia, they're getting help from China. So this propaganda campaign is working. Even me as a Brexiteer can say it's not all the EU's fault. This is a wedge being driven down by Russia, by China. Now, would China pay? Even if we could get a court of international law or domestic law to say yes, China is responsible, would they come out and pay? Now, there are interesting ways, like three-dimensional ways, that you could basically claw this money back from China. So this is from Investopedia. How much US debt does China own? The Chinese do own a lot of US debt, about 1.1 trillion US dollars. So the Henry Jackson Society study was saying that it's something like 933 billion pounds. So Investopedia, this is as of 2020, China owns about 1.1 trillion dollars, that's going to be slightly less than 933 billion pounds. But we could potentially see this really depends on who wins the presidential election this year. If it's Trump, I mean, Trump's played it very calm up until now against China. but when this coronavirus, when we're over the back of it, when the dust has finally settled, I think people are going to be very, very angry. I mean, just the general citizens in these countries, just judging by from what we're here in the UK, people aren't particularly angry at China. Remember, when the body count is finally tallied up, when we start reflecting on whose fault this was, I think people are going to be very, very angry. And potentially, if we have politicians out there call in to say, look, the US has sold $1.1 trillion of bonds to China, let's just cancel them. Just cancel them. Just say, look, you've caused over $1 trillion of damage in this nation. If you're not going to pay, we're just going to wipe your bonds out. Now, this does have other long-term consequences. Potentially, we don't want to just go down a road to spite China that essentially destroys ourselves. We don't want to just become a nation that doesn't pay its bonds back, doesn't, agree with the rule of law. But it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult. I think to a certain extent, there's going to have to be a lot of reflection done after this coronavirus thing, because the UK isn't without responsibility, right? I think MI6, the security agencies who pretty much spy on China and Russia are pretty much the two main targets, besides, listening on terrorists, which tend to be like smaller cells, maybe Iran. But when you're looking at big nation states, MI6, GCHQ, the security agencies, they're looking at China and Russia pretty much more than any other nation. How did they fail to pick up on the intelligence coming out of China that this COVID-19 was big and we should start readying ourselves in the UK immediately? They would have had that intelligence like by end of December. There should have been analysts at MI6 that were picking up on the wires, on the chatter, trawling social media from the doctor whistleblowers who were going on Weibo and WeChat and these various Chinese social medias saying this isn't good. I don't know, MI6 should have raised the flag a lot earlier. Now, I think the future, ultimately, whatever happens with these bonds, whatever happens with China paying back reparations, if it does, if it doesn't, if we choose to say, seize Chinese assets in the UK, if we say, look, China's done a lot of investment in the UK. I mean, a lot of it's really through private industry, but most of these private industries are backed at some level by the Chinese government. We could just seize those assets. The UK doesn't have as many bonds or gilts owned by China as the US. The US is heavily reliant on China for buying its debt. But we probably still have something in the region like £50 billion. We could also just nullify that, or even in the best case scenario, say we'll pay back good on the bond, but we won't give you any interest on it. That's something that America could do as well. They could say, well, we will pay back the bonds you own, but we won't put any interest on it. Long term, that'll be very damaging for the Federal Reserve, for the UK Treasury, because we'll get to a point where people think, oh, well, should I buy UK bonds? Should I buy US bonds? So it's not something that'll definitely happen, but there are these tools in the armory. Potentially, we also have tools in the armory for seizing Chinese assets in the UK. I don't think long term is necessarily a good idea. I'm just saying these are potential ideas that may start coming out in the woodwork when the dust settles and the anger over China and potentially populist governments who will say, well, let's just cancel the debt. Let's just seize Chinese assets in the UK. It's probably not really the ideal road to go down. It's probably not the road to go down that will make the US and the UK great, if we can ever be great again. This is the post-virus world. I think ultimately in reflecting from this is many mistakes were made. Many mistakes were made in the globalization of the world. I'm pro-free markets, but when the counterparty is a totalitarian regime, there needs to be some responsibility and not being over-reliant on totalitarian regimes being truthful. If a virus is rapidly spreading through a totalitarian population, a communist party is very much likely to try and suppress that information. We still have many, inherent instabilities in the system. The EU or Europe as a whole, not so much the UK, but Europe as a whole, gets 30% of its gas from Russia. What sort of security risk is that? We still have a nation which is heavily reliant on imports for its food. That's a issue of national security. So when the dust settles at the end of COVID-19, many questions need to be asked about the mistakes that were made over the last, say, 30 years in the build-up to globalization to where we are now, and how we can mitigate these problems in the future, because the world has changed now. This virus will change the way people see the world. I think, well, hopefully lessons will be learned. Hopefully people will say, well, we shouldn't be too overly reliant on totalitarian regimes in, 1,000 miles away, several thousand miles away, telling the truth. We shouldn't be overly reliant on a system that for especially things like food, where we are overly reliant on imports. I mean, yes, things you can't really grow in the UK, fine, import those, but we should have a bulk amount of calories in store, that when issues like this rise again, because they probably will do, many lessons probably won't be learnt, and things like this probably will happen again. Coronaviruses only begin worse in its various forms, like SARS, MERS. Now this COVID-19 is just SARS-2. That's what the World Health Organization call it. So quite likely down the road we'll see a SARS-3. Many lessons need to be learnt, but ultimately it's an interesting one where we go with this. Now, how do you think this will play out? Do you think China will potentially be giving G7 nations reparations, and to what value? To what value? Will the totalitarian party of China, will they pay good on their debts, or are we more likely to see something like just essentially what would tantamount to be a default on our bond obligations to China? It's interesting where it goes now. Things are probably going to get a lot more populist before they go back to normal. I expect over the next few years, various parties coming out the woodwork with some fairly crazy ideas, and this probably is one of them. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying this is the road that the UK and US and G7 nations should go down, because it's something of a road of just an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I'm not saying it's good. I'm saying this is quite possibly something that will potentially happen. Thanks for watching this video. I'd love to know your comments on this one. It's an interesting study anyway. Go and read it if you have the time. Jason from Liberty Bunkers signing off, and I'll see you in the next video.